Hi, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a great opportunity to connect, network, get some business cards, make some friends, etc. Now we're turning it over to my dear friend Paolo, who's going to take us through a simulation of some of his work, like research and his work in this space. And so not only is he a wonderful conference host, but he is also a scientist. So, wow.
I know, amazing. Thank you, Monroe, and thank you everybody for being here. And I'm going to set my own timer so that I don't forget, since I'm not there waving at myself, although I think Monroe will. So it's a real pleasure to be here. And today what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure this clicker is working properly. Let's see. Actually, can you, let's see if I can get Nathan to start. Here we go. Okay. I'm going to make sure this is working. Here we go. So I'm going to start out by addressing what I call the white elephant in the room and sort of answering the question of what is a guy like me doing in a place like this. And in particular, what I mean by that, as you can tell, I'm white, I'm male, I identify as male, I'm cisgender, heterosexual. And I like to joke with people that I'm an immigrant, but I mean, I was born and raised in Italy, which means that I have to go back to Italy every year. Woe is me. So really, I have every ounce of privilege that I could possibly ask for. So what am I doing working in DEI? Well, my journey kind of started with a personal interest in DEI when I first came to this country and first realized some of the very strange things that I was observing in society. And watching my daughter go through school, being really good at math and technology, and deciding that she wanted to have nothing to do with those fields, going into finance and running away screaming a couple of years later because of how she was treated as a woman, which is all very cliche. But what happened to me in particular was that I was always struck by the incredible difference between the individual stories that I would hear from people, like those of you that don't look like me, about the horrible things that happened to them on the one hand, but when it came to solutions, it was these very lofty goals. How do we need to change the hearts and minds of the American, whatever economies or whatever the case might be. And I was always struck by that strange gap between the individual and the systemic. And then what I realized one day, I was literally sitting in a session, in one of the many sessions I used to go to about DEI in technology or in marketing, and I realized that the work that I had been doing, which has been grounded first in academia and then as a consultant, and it was really grounded on analyzing and quantifying that link between individuals and the organizations for which they work, or individuals and the societal context in which they work, or in which they exist. And I realized that maybe there was a way to take my work and bring into that space. That was in late 2015. I literally dropped everything that I was doing and I started to work in this space. And it has been, on the one hand, amazingly rewarding because I feel like I'm doing something that can actually make an impact, but it's also given me a sense of responsibility. I realized, past my ignorance, I thought that I used to think I was passionate about DEI. I had no clue. And I still don't have any clue. In fact, I probably understand now just how little I still understand. But one thing that I do understand is that it is people like me who sometimes inadvertently and sometimes not so inadvertently are causing the problem. So to me, DEI, and I love the fact that we should not talk about deficit, it is a deficit. It is a deficit on the part of white people like me. And it's extremely important for people like me to not only to admit that, acknowledge it, but recognize that until people like me get into the conversation and learn to move from being part of the problem to being part of the solution, things are not going to change. And the things that we heard from people like Dr. Payton and from Deborah Archer, the fact that things do not change, and it's really depressing. So I think it's incredibly important. So I hope that you will appreciate what I have to tell you. And I've done something a little bit, this is going to be a little bit different. This is really diving into some of the research and scientific roots of my work. Recording in progress. What happens if I do what so many people do, what so many companies do, which is I create a more diverse organization just from the bottom up? And what happens if I make it completely diverse? And I asked you, how will the performance of this company change? Not on average, but for this company. The answer is we have no idea. And the reason we have no idea is because we don't have any tools that can help us to understand the impact of diversifying human assets. Now, this is peculiar because if you think about every other aspect of the economy that has to do with dealing with assets, we know that diversification works. We do it in advertising. We do it in finance. We do it in R&D. Whenever we have assets, we have tools that help us to diversify those assets. And one thing that we know is that performance always improves through diversification. So it follows that if we learn how to diversify human assets, forget about justice and everything else, but we're clearly missing out on opportunity because our companies, our schools, our universities, every aspect of our society where people are an asset could potentially benefit if we learn how to diversify in a meaningful way. Now, I thought, well, let's put this in perspective. And I kind of asked myself, well, if I'm trying to speak to a leader of a company, how can I convince them that this is actually worth their time? And I started to do some digging and I thought, well, let's try to look at the data. Let's look at how much companies spend annually on advertising, on R&D, and on payroll. Not all labor costs, just payroll. And I asked myself, which of these is bigger? Is it R&D? Is it advertising? Or is it payroll? And so I'm going to ask you to do a show of hand. For those of you that are online, I can't see the people on Zoom. But so I'm curious to see how many people feel. So if I ask you to choose which, whoops, sorry, these things are skipping. If I ask you to, how many of you think that advertising is the biggest amount of spend of most companies? So if you looked at all companies across the United States, okay, advertising, we only see, okay, a few hands, okay. What about R&D? Who think that R&D is bigger than advertising? And what about payroll? Okay, so some people. So what I usually see, depending on the audience, is that usually the majority choose advertising and some people choose payroll. What most people find very surprising is that not only is advertising bigger, but we spend actually now 250, it's gone up, $200 billion a year on advertising, 500 on R&D, and it's over $6 trillion a year on payroll, which means that payroll, human assets, cost most companies on average around 12 times R&D and 30 times advertising. So this I found really surprising because what it suggests, whoops, sorry about that. It's very interesting to see the thing backwards in the mirror, as somebody else was saying, is that for every company, we know that people are both the most valuable asset and the most significant budget item. So that suggests that we have an incredible opportunity. It should really be the responsibility of every CEO to do everything they can to figure out how they can leverage this incredible asset. And to the extent that any CEO is not taking this very seriously, they're missing out on an incredible competitive advantage. And I would argue that anybody that figures this out will absolutely leave everybody else in the dust. Now, you will notice that I didn't talk about the moral imperative. I'm not talking about ROI. I'm just making a very, very simple argument about the fact that people ought to at least be motivated to look at it. So if that's the case, why is it that how can we prove? Wow, this is really very confusing. I'm going to stand over here because I'm used to having my laptop in front of me. So why has it been so hard to show that DI is actually an advantage? And I think that the main reason is because when we tend to look at companies and organizations, most management approaches and analytical approaches are based on what I call a reductionist approach. In other words, we start with a real organization that has real people, and we try to reduce it to this. We try to reduce it to an org chart where we neatly organize people into boxes. And then when we're trying to fix the problem, what do? Oh, we figure out where there is a problem and we fix it, right? So this is a bit tongue-in-cheek. Oh, here's where the problem is. And it's always the little people. It's always the people that are down at the lower levels. It's always the frontline workers who coincidentally happen to also be where you have the greatest amount of diversity. This kind of approach simply does not work. My claim is that reductionist approaches do not work because of the fact that every organization is actually what I would describe as a complex system. And reductionist approaches do not work. You cannot just simply take a complex system apart, fix one piece, and put it back in the equation. So what I need to do is to give you a bit of a definition of this idea of complex systems, which is actually the scientific root of how I came into this field. And what I will do is to give you two ingredients that make a system complex. First, if a system has a lot of elements and these elements are interconnected to one another. Secondly, there has to be what I call emergent behaviors. What do I mean by emergent behaviors? This requires another slide. The idea of an emergent behavior is a behavior that is exhibited at the level of the entire system that is not obvious to deduce, even if you know what the individual elements are doing. So it's a behavior that results from all the interactions. And I like to give examples from Mother Nature to start. So we see flock of geese flying in a V formation. But what you don't see is the pilot goose with earphones telling the other people, okay, you go 20 degrees to the right, you go 20 degrees to the left. That's not what happens. It's just through the interactions with the birds in the environment that they fly in a V formation. One of my favorite pictures from National Geographic several years ago was of this shark moving through a school of fish. Now, the school of fish behave like an organism. They look like a single organism. And yet they don't use TikTok or Instagram or Twitter to communicate with each other. How do they do that? Well, this is the idea of emergent behaviors. It's a lot of interactive elements that makes them behave in a way that we have a very hard time predicting. Now, not all examples of complex systems come from nature. In fact, it turns out that most human systems that we deal with, we tend to ignore the fact that they're all very complex. Examples might include traffic. Whoa, wow, this is kind of, I can see why Faye was struggling too. This is like you click it once and it goes 5 times. Traffic jams. We go to work in our cars. So luckily for me, I use the subway, but nobody gets up in the morning and says, I want to cause a traffic jam. We're all trying to do the same thing. We're trying to go from point A to point B as quickly as possible. But as a result of all of our interactions with one another and with the environment, we cause traffic jams. Another example is stock markets. No single individual person knows what's going to happen to the price of a stock. It's an emergent behavior. And of course, sports teams are another example, and organizations are a canonical example of a complex system. And if you think about the definition that I gave you of the individual elements and then the fact that you have these emergent behaviors, it can help you to see organizations in a different light. So here is a company. The company is not the building. The company is the collection of all the people that make it up. And when we think about making a company successful, and we think about the kinds of organizational goals that we're used to thinking about, it's going to be things like employee recruiting, employee retention, the level of diversity, market share, profitability, reputations. These are all emergent behaviors. They're the results of what everybody's doing together. But if you're managing a company, you can't directly control market share. You can't directly control diversity. God knows that people try and it doesn't work. Instead, what we're constantly doing as managers is that we try to influence the employees in order to achieve the desired emergent behaviors. In other words, we are trying to control a complex system, but the only thing that we can control is the people. We can't really, well, maybe we can control the products and things of that sort, but we cannot directly manipulate some of these emergent things that are what matter ultimately in terms of performance. And that's why I believe that reductionism is not the right approach. And I'm going to tell you about this very simple game that, in fact, maybe later we can play it here, but I don't want to get everybody out of the chairs. But there's this game that really exemplifies why it's so dangerous to try to take a reductionist approach. Suppose you find yourself in a room, and by the way, I've played this game with rooms of Cub Scouts and with rooms of CEOs. I've played it with anywhere from 8 people to 300 people, and it always works. And it goes something like this. If you were all standing around, I would ask you, okay, each of you look around and choose 2 people. Don't tell them who they are. But so this is you, and then you choose one person to be the aggressor and one person to be the defender. And your goal, there's the defender. When I say go, I want you to move in such a way that essentially the defender blocks you from the aggressor. So you say that and people go, and some people are confused. But what happens is that people move around like galaxies and nothing much happens. And then you say, stop. Let's play the same game, but with a slightly different set of rules. You're still there in the middle, and there's still 2 other people that you choose, but now you're the defender. And you choose one person to be the aggressor and the other person to be the person that you are defending. So now what happens is that when I say go, I want you to move in such a way, well, it kind of gave the punchline away. I want you to move in such a way that you are blocking the aggressor from seeing the other person. The moment that you say go, within 5 seconds, everybody collapses into a ball. And it works all the time. It's an emergent behavior, right? We didn't tell people, go put yourself in a cluster. We said something very different. Why is this an interesting kind of unpredictable behavior? And why does this speak about the importance of using these examples to talk about complexity? Well, think about the fact that we have what I call a deceptively simple complex system. Because what we have is, even though we know the behavior of every single individual, it's incredibly difficult to predict what the whole system will do. But even more so, we made a tiny little change to a rule of the game, and the behavior that we got was radically different. So now you imagine you're running a company of 100,000 people or even of 200 people, and you have an idea for something that will make things work better. Oh, I'm going to change the compensation level of these people. Be very careful, because what often happens is exactly what you saw in that game, except now it happens to you running a company, and the whole company falls apart. So the message here is that we need to be extremely careful about the fact that companies are complex systems, but how do we actually analyze that? And this is where a lot of my work comes into play, and it's this idea of what I call agent-based simulation. Now, the field that I spent many years studying is known as complexity science. Whoever came up with that name was not a marketer. It's not a very cool name, but really maybe should be called simplicity science. Agent-based simulation, which also sounds terrible. I think of the Matrix every time I think of that. It's like Agent Smith. But in a way, if you believe in the Matrix being a simulation, that's kind of what it's all about. But it's essentially about simulating systems from the point of view of individuals. At its basis, it's an interdisciplinary approach that combines two fields: behavioral sciences that help us to understand the behaviors of individuals, how they react to one another, how they react to their environment, and then computer simulations that help us to put the things together. So it's very difficult mathematically to write an equation of what happens when you put 50 people in a room. But if you just simulate it, just like a Sims game, where literally individual simulated people are interacting with each other, then you can watch the behavior of the system evolve, just like we do with the real world. And it turns out that this approach is extremely powerful. And it completely changes the viewpoint, so that instead of thinking top-down, percentages, statistics, averages, standard deviations, you literally start to think about things from a human-centric. You think about, what is this person experiencing? How do they interact with one another and with the environment? Then you have each agent follow rules. And those rules are also influenced by their experiences and their interactions with other people. You let the simulation run and you watch the overall system behavior emerge from the interactions, just like they do in the real world system. So I'm going to show you some examples of the kinds of things that you can do with these principles. The first one is just a toy example. It's actually the game that I just showed you. And it's going to switch back and forth between the two rules. Each dot represents a person. Each dot has very, very simple rules. You're going to choose two people. One is the aggressor, one is the defender. And then when you switch the rule, you become the defender, and you can see it collapsing in a ball. And the little video is just going to go back and forth. Now, this is a pretty boring example, but one of the beauties is that it shows you that it doesn't matter if it's old people, young people, how tall, how short, whether they're Cub Scouts or CEOs. What you're doing is you're essentially distilling out the behaviors that matter to explain that particular phenomenon. So let's look at something a little bit more real world. And I'm going to go very quickly through a few examples of simulations that I've personally worked on. And I'm going to start with issues that have to do with organizational management. And the first project is actually a project that was done in collaboration with a former master student, Ali Naqdi, in which he was interested in the impact of social media on recruiting. And in particular, was interested in how tools like Glassdoor influence people's perception about what companies they want to work for. So taking this kind of human-centric approach, we built a simulation in which we assume that there are people that are evaluating jobs at two different companies. And these companies are identical, except for their level of diversity and inclusion. And for the sake of the argument, for simplicity, let's assume that we're going to look at those who identify as women and those who identify as men, and try to understand the differences in their perceptions of companies on the basis of diversity. This simulation that we built represents one company on the right side, one company on the left side. The yellow and blue tell you how many men and women are at each organization. In this case, they're both the same. The dots in the middle represent the perception of potential candidates as to whether they favor one company or the other. When the companies are identical, we see that both men and women like them equally, and we can use data from the marketplace to find out, typically what is the typical cost of hiring somebody. And right now they're the same. What happens if one of the companies is actually significantly less diverse than the other? Interestingly, what happens is that when the company on the right is dominated by men, the men don't care. They don't notice. They don't really care about the fact that it's 60% men, but the women do. They notice it. And this is, by the way, based on real research, on actual data out there, which makes sense. And what you find is that the women are less inclined to work for this company. What's going to happen Well, clearly, you're going to have to work harder to recruit the same number of people. You're shrinking your talent pool. And that can actually be translated into a monetary cost that results from the fact that you're less diverse. But less diverse is only something that people see by going on your website or, whatever the case might be. What's even more important is what happens when you're actually less inclusive. And one way that we simulated that was by assuming that you have Glassdoor, and when you turn it on, meaning that people hear about what goes on inside the company, and the women hear that it's actually not very inclusive towards women, they move even farther away, and it costs you even more money. So this is one example of taking a fairly simple concept, taking some real data, and creating a simulation that quantifies the impact of being less diverse and less inclusive in recruitment. Now I'm going to shift to the inside of an organization, and I'm actually going to, whoops, sorry. And this is work that I've done, sorry, the quote went by, but this is work that I've done with my colleague, Chibin Zhang, in which we simulate a 4-layer company. And again, for simplicity, we're only looking at men and women, but we can capture any level of diversity, any level of intersectionality that we want. But we're trying to come up with a very simple principle approach to studying the impact of biases. So here's a company. This company is very simple. You go from entry-level management, VPs, and executives. And the company doesn't really do anything interesting, but it grows over time. And then what you're going to see when I run the simulation is that some people get promoted, and then some people pop up and turn gray and disappear. Those are the ones that are leaving the company or getting terminated. But the punchline is that if you run for the equivalent of about 5 years, you find that the company remains very well balanced. Now, we asked ourselves the following question. What happens if we introduce a bias in the way that people are promoted? What happens if instead of simply promoting people based on seniority, which is what the original simulation was doing, what happens if now, if you're a man, you get a slight advantage in the promotion process? Not that that ever happens in the real world, right? But what would happen in the simulation? Well, let's find out. We take exactly the same simulation. We start at 50-50. It's running a little bit faster this time. And lo and behold, what you find is that after only 5 years of simulated time, you get a company that looks suspiciously like real companies, where the top is male-dominated, and then you get increasing numbers of women as you go toward the bottom. At the point that in the entry level, even though you're hiring the same number of men and women, you have more women because they're stuck while their male colleagues are getting promoted. Instead of being men and women, this could be Black people, white people. It could be people with disabilities, people with no disabilities. The same exact argument can be made for virtually every kind of difference. Now, I didn't have time to do this, but I have another simulation that I won't show you that it's exactly the same. But what I did is I asked myself the following question. If talent was equally distributed, and you assume that men and women or people of color and white people have the same degree of talent, and you apply this kind of process where there is a bias that makes it more difficult for somebody to get promoted, what will happen? 2 things will happen. 1, representation will decrease. There will be fewer Black people. There will be fewer Hispanic people. There will be fewer women. 2, the average talent of the people that make it through is higher. And I can actually quantify. In fact, I wrote a kind of a tongue-in-cheek article in Forbes that said, here's quantitative proof that Black women will make better leaders. Because if you are, there is the old saying, right? That if you're a Black man, you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. If you're a Black woman, you have to work 3 times as hard to get a third as far. And it's absolutely true. And I think that some of the incredible speakers that you saw before are a testament to that. And you can kind of prove that quantitatively. There is no way that you can go, one of the charts that Dr. Payton showed, that showed kind of like the decline in representation as you go up through the ranks. There is no way, unless you firmly believe that white men are superior, and if you believe that, I don't recommend that you say that loudly. I'm the only white man here today, so it's okay, you can say that. But so this is a profound way of, again, taking a really simple idea and applying it to real world problems. And by the way, this was just the, we actually matched data from real industries to show that we can match with a high degree of accuracy, essentially the level of bias within an organization that explains why you go in industries like retail, where you start with more than 60% women at the entry level, and you end up with less than 30% at the executive level. I'm going to show you one other, well, I'm just going to go through this very quickly, but one of the advantages of this approach is that you can actually track satisfaction of these agents. And in this case, what we did is we assumed that if somebody gets promoted and somebody does not get promoted and the junior person get promoted ahead of them, their satisfaction goes down a little bit. It will come back up. But in the simulation that I showed you before, the women are systematically being discriminated against. their satisfaction goes down. The men are fine. Hey, I got promoted. I deserve that. So what's going to happen? Well, clearly their productivity will go down. The productivity of the whole company will suffer, and they will leave the company. And that's going to have an impact on your top line and your bottom line. Again, this is a very generic argument. I happen to use men and women because it would be very difficult to use a 20-dimensional graph, but you get the point. Anybody who is being discriminated against is going to see the same thing. I'm out of time, so I'm going to go very quickly. So the other example that I wanted to show you is more related to where we are today, and it's about the tenure track faculty journey. And in fact, this is a grant. This was supported by an NSF grant. It was actually Dr. Payton, who's no longer here. But basically what we did is that we looked at the typical journey of people that go through the academic environment, right? You start, you get a job as an assistant professor, you may leave, but if you make it through, you go through mid-tenure review, which is kind of an up or out kind of process. And then if you're fortunate enough, you may eventually go up for tenure. Again, you may go up or out. And if you succeed, then eventually you might become an associate professor, and then eventually you might become a full professor. Here's the key. To the extent that there are negative workplace experiences that influence your career advancement, and that those experiences are different for different people, there is going to be a difference in outcomes. So we built a very simple computer simulation that essentially tracks the steps that people go through to get to become full professors and then eventually to retire. And what we can do very simply is to just show how having different, so in the case where there are absolutely no biases, if you look at the histogram on the left and on the right, you see that the same number of in this case, white and brown people are making it through, stays consistent. But when there is so here we see that there's equal numbers going in and coming out of the system. But when you introduce a bias, you find that lo and behold, you're losing a lot more of the non-white people in the early stages. You end up with very few people of color in the upper stages, and you end up with a very biased outcome. So I'm going to conclude. I had another one, but I'm going to skip it because we're out of time. But the conclusion that I want to make is that I hope that this gives you some insights into the power of research, into the power of using quantitative approaches, and not just doing research in terms of counting and doing historical research, which is incredibly important. But we need to leverage what we know as researchers, what we know as scientists, what we know as engineers, and bring it to bear to help us to actually understand the roots of some of these problems so that we can actually take some of these key concepts and translate them into very tangible ideas of how we can make the world a better place. So that's it, and thank you very much.
Just brilliant, Paolo. Thank you so much for taking us through this framework and through your different simulations, and also for compelling upon us how scientists, engineers can also be a part of the solution in helping us find a pathways forward. Thank you so very much.